Welcome to another episode of Talking Till Dawn, the first of 2021. I'm Martin, and via the modern marvel of telephony, all the way from glittering Uddingston, I'm joined by Mr. Michael Whitehouse.
Good evening, everybody. How are we all?
Yeah, I don't want to be that annoying guy who's still saying Happy New Year at the tail end of January, but how has your 2021 been so far?
I think the same as everyone else's, which is really bizarre. I've lost £15.
That's pretty good.
So that's...
What did you spend it on?
Haha! Dun-dun-dun-ch. But to be fair, that's since like November, so I've probably lost, I don't know, £4 or £5 since after Christmas.
That's more than a stone though altogether.
Yeah, I was getting really heavy. It's one of those frustrating ones. I need to lose so much weight just to be heavy. Like to go down from obese to fat. That's what I have to do. I'm getting there. What about you? What's been happening?
You should start an exercise video program or something and call it Get Fat with Michael Whitehouse. I'm not saying you're fat, it's just the way you put that there.
I am.
Just to get to fat. Yeah, I'm good, all things considered. I think there's light just about visible at the end of a few different tunnels right now. You know,
Yeah. Spring
spring is almost within reach. Out the back of my home, as you face south, there's a row of buildings which in the depths of winter. If I struggle with the word depths, this episode is going to be problematic. In the depths of winter, the midday sun is too low to rise over the rooftops and actually shine directly into my windows. It kind of peaks between the houses at one point, but we're at such a high latitude here in Scotland, winters are dark and the sun is low in the sky for a chunk of the year.
Yeah.
For a good couple of months, it doesn't rise above these buildings from the perspective of where I usually sit working. Well, a couple of days ago, I was sitting in the little study which I've got set up here in the spare room, which I use for writing and recording these episodes, and I was working on this very episode at the time, and suddenly something is bugging me. There's this dazzling light, Michael, in the corner of my eye, and it was the sun just grazing the rooftops of the buildings, and I just sat and basked in it for a few minutes until it disappeared again.
Beautiful.
Such a great moment.
It wasn't space lips spitting on you.
Sky spitter? No, it was the anti-sky spitter. It was the sky shiner.
I'll never go over that.
Don't get me wrong, look, I do see daylight the rest of the winter. We're not Greenland. I don't want to sound like some malnourished cave dweller. It was just amazing to be sitting in my house and actually feel direct sunlight on my face for the first time this year.
It definitely picks you up.
Oh aye, there's something like elemental about it, psychologically uplifting. And I think it's a good augur of life in general at the minute. Summer days might still look a long way off, and they are still a long way off, but you know, we are moving on. Things are happening.
Definitely.
So tonight we are going to be looking at probably the broadest topic we've ever attempted on Talking Till Dawn. I think we'll call this episode Giant Sea Monsters Attack.
Yes.
Which I think might be self-explanatory.
Hold on. Let me rub my hands together. Here we go. I'm ready.
So this is going to be at least a two-parter, but given the breadth of the subject and all the legends and folklore and the huge variety of alleged encounters all around the world, even in 3 or 4 hours worth of podcast, we'd have no chance of being able to give a complete overview of the topic. So consider this, I don't even want to say greatest hits, but like a sampler of the topic. Just a selection of a few cases and legends that caught my eye while I've been researching these past few weeks. This is not the be-all and end-all. It's a two-parter for now, but I can almost guarantee we will return to this subject matter further down the line. The first part of this is maybe going to be slightly more grounded, slightly more on the kind of scientific side of things, and the second part, things are going to get a bit crazy. That's all I'll say for now. So, to kick things off, let me spin you a salty old yarn, Michael.
I'm ready.
It's April the 30th, 1918. War is raging across Europe. The British Admiralty drifter Coreopsis II is patrolling the North Channel somewhere between Belfast Lough in Northern Ireland and the Mull of Galloway in the far southwest of Scotland. This is a choke point, a narrow, strategically important passage, about 20 to 25 miles wide here, connecting the Irish Sea in the south to the Firth of Clyde in the northeast and the Atlantic Ocean in the northwest. The Coreopsis was not much of a warship. It must have seemed like almost a suicide mission to be handed, taken to the seas in a tiny 88-ton ex-fishing boat with a 3-inch naval gun and a depth charge rack hastily bolted to the deck, hunting a far larger and more lethal quarry than yourself, because in 1917, beneath these familiar waters to us, Michael, lurked a truly terrifying and deadly predator. One that hid beneath the glassy waves, that preyed on shipping, and had, in the preceding 3 years, sent tens of thousands of sailors to a dark, drowning death. The U-boats, the 500-ton sea monsters of the Imperial German Navy. And on April the 30th, 1918, the little Coreopsis came face to face with a heavily armed submarine, at the surface, a few miles off Stranraer. This is it. Trouser gravy time.
Sorry, I enjoyed that. What beautiful pictures you paint.
The Coreopsis did what she had been sent to do. She opened fire on the submarine. The German vessel dived to evade the barrage. I would guess that the crew of the Coreopsis expected, at best, never to see the submarine again. At worst, maybe a torpedo up the beef tub. But just a few minutes later, the submarine breached the surface again and hoisted the white flag of surrender. The U-boat, it turned out, was a vessel designated SM UB-85, a type UB-3 coastal attack submarine with a complement of 10 torpedoes, 8.8cm deck guns, 3 officers and 31 sailors. A huge prize for these Allied sailors. Why on earth would the crew of a deadly U-boat, heavily armoured and bristling with weapons, surrender so readily to a little boat like the Coreopsis? Well, allegedly, when the crew of the submarine were brought on board as prisoners, they told a tale straight out of a Michael Whitehouse book.
Beautiful.
They'd surfaced the previous evening to recharge the UB-85's batteries. As they did so, the U-boat was rocked by a violent impact and a churning, surging of water against the starboard side. Captain Gunther Krech and a detachment of sailors emerged from the conning tower to investigate, and were stunned at what they saw in front of them. Stretched across the forward deck of the vessel was the thing Krech would describe to the crew of the Coreopsis as ein seltsames Wesen, a strange beast. He described it as immensely large, long with a horned skull, deep-set eyes, and a huge mouth packed with razor-sharp teeth that glistened in the light of the waxing gibbous moon. It was crawling out of the sea onto the deck of the UB-85, and its weight was enough to cause the sub to lean perilously to starboard. Captain Krech and his men opened fire on the monster with their sidearms. This seemed to do little but anger the thing. It latched its jaws onto the forward-mounted gun and began tearing at it and thrashing its horns against the ship. In desperation, Captain Krech ordered a sustained barrage of volley fire directed at the creature. Only then did the strange beast relax its grip and tumble back into the Irish Sea. Whether in retreat or in death, they would never know. But as relieved as they may have been, the crew of the U-boat soon discovered that the beast's attack on the vessel had not only completely mangled the mounted gun, but had damaged several hull plates. This was why the Coreopsis had later come upon the UB-85 floating at the surface in broad daylight. A compromised hull, of course, meant the submarine could no longer fully submerge, and when the Coreopsis' attack compelled her crew to attempt such a manoeuvre out of desperation, she immediately started taking on water and was forced to resurface and surrender. It certainly answers the question of how a wee boat like the Coreopsis was able to so easily and quickly capture a huge submarine. They had help. It's a striking tale.
I'm loving it. I have to say, I'm loving it. I'm having images of a pulp novel.
Yeah.
With the waves crashing against the submarine on the surface of the water, and this huge beast rising out of the water, tearing it to pieces.
It reminds me of, do you remember the movie The Land That Time Forgot?
Yeah.
The story reminds me of that, for sure. The creature, as it's described, isn't particularly similar to any of the sort of usual suspects in modern cryptozoology. There's some similarities with sea serpents in general, but with the horns and the sharp teeth, the closest thing it resembles in my mind is like something from ancient or Norse mythology, like Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent that the god Thor is supposed to fight at Ragnarok, or maybe like some variant of the European dragon. To me, on the one hand, that all does give it the feel of kind of seaman's lore. You know, it feels like a tall tale. And yet, on the other hand, allegedly, you've got dozens of witnesses, physical damage left behind, physical traces, things that could, in theory, be used to corroborate the details of the account. If this really happened as it's claimed to have happened, then that is a major event, an understudied incident that could lead to major zoological discoveries.
Tell me it's real, Martin. Tell me it's real.
When I first came across this story on Mysterious Universe, my first thought was, we need more information here. We need more information. So
yeah,
it turns out, Michael, that in 2016, after the Mysterious Universe article was published, engineers working on behalf of Scottish Power on a cable laying project in the Channel discovered what they believed to be the wreck of the UB-85. On the topic of subs, incidentally, do us all a favour and subscribe to Talking Till Dawn right now.
Nice, that's a good segue.
Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, we don't mind where you do it. Just hit that button while you're here. Promise you won't regret it. Should we wait for them to do that, Michael? Just leave some dead air?
Yes. I just space. It's the sound of rushing water.
There is some debate as to whether this is the UB-85. Some have argued what was found by Scottish Power was a World War II sub that was captured and held in Loch Ryan before being scuttled offshore. That's possible. Scottish Power themselves raised the possibility that it could also be another World War I submarine, the UB-82, one of the 85's sister ships, which was also sunk in the North Channel in a separate incident. However, the UB-82 was lost quite a bit further to the northwest, between the Mull of Kintyre and Tor Head in Northern Ireland, and was destroyed with depth charges, killing all on board. The multi-beam sonar image of the submarine wreck off the Mull of Galloway, the images are incredibly detailed. Actually, I'll show you.
Oh, nice.
So
that was fantastic.
So this shows a vessel that is remarkably intact. There is some compression to the rear of the vessel, you'll notice behind the conning tower. But I don't know, it doesn't look to me like a ship that's being bombarded.
No.
So of those two World War I vessels, I would lean towards this being the UB-85. If it is the UB-85, then that's interesting as well, because the forward gun is actually visible on the sonar images. You see it just in front of the conning tower there. It's pointing off to the starboard side.
Yeah.
But to my eye, it appears to be intact. Surprisingly intact, you might say, for a 100-year-old wreck. Now, the sonar image probably doesn't give us enough to be able to disprove the story. There's enough vagueness. There's enough room for potential exaggeration in exactly how much damage the creature is supposed to have inflicted on the forward gun. And as detailed as the sonar image is, there's just enough detail of the vessel lost in it that there could be some damage we're just not seeing, you know. So it doesn't disprove it, but it definitely doesn't do a great deal to support the story either. There also doesn't appear to be any obvious damage to the hull plates at the front of the ship where the monster is supposed to have attacked it. So that doesn't, kill the story, but it's maybe the first little stumbling block here.
It's a little bit difficult to tell, from looking at the picture.
Mm.
I know what you mean. The gun looks relatively intact, but it's difficult to tell what sort of damage the vessel's really encountered in a lot of ways.
Definitely, and we can't say for sure based on this image, but it is a remarkably clear image. It is cool to see it. As far as I can tell, no one has ever dived down to the wreck to have a look yet. It's in fairly deep water. We're talking 75 to 100 meters. These are often quite heavy seas. The channel has a lot of large shipping traffic. it's not easy to just pop down there with scuba gear for a nose around. But maybe to get the answers we're after here, we don't need to. This is the seizure of an enemy vessel in home waters, a recorded military action in a modern war. There should be records of this event. And in fact, there are.
I'm getting excited, man. I'm getting excited. Don't let me down.
The available British records on the incident are very minimal, sticking only to the facts of the vessel being captured by the Coreopsis II and where that happened and who the captain was, that sort of thing. Captain Craig himself died only 2 years later at the age of 33 on the 5th of March 1919. He was still in British captivity at that time. It's not clear what he died of, but given his young age, given the date of death, and given the fact the war was over by then, and the fact he was still awaiting repatriation at the time, rather topically, I think it's quite possible he died of the Spanish flu. Spanish flu was decimating prisoners of war and returning frontline soldiers around that time. But the point being, he didn't survive long enough to really tell his side of the tale in any kind of post-war memoir, as many officers did. However, at the end of the Second World War, when Allied forces occupied Nazi Germany, the Americans seized the complete records of the German Navy, not only for World War II, but records covering the period right back to 1850. These were then transferred to microfilm and are now stored in the National Archives and Records Administration of the United States. In the late 90s and early 2000s, a retired detective turned naval historian called Dwight R. Messimer trawled through this huge tranche of documents to compile an authoritative and painstaking study of every U-boat lost in the First World War. He published his findings in 2002 in a reference work entitled Verschollen, World War I U-boat losses. This tome includes detailed information on the loss of the UB-85, direct from the German Admiralty, including personal statements from the UB-85's senior stoker, Julius Gottshammer, and Captain Gunter Krech himself. I'm guessing he was allowed to send a report back by mail or diplomatic channels in 1918 from the British prisoner of war camp where he would eventually die. Would you like to hear what these records tell us about how the UB-85 met its demise?
Yes, please.
So according to Captain Krech, the U-boat was at the surface heading up the North Channel when they spotted a British patrol boat in the distance, i.e. the Coreopsis. Krech ordered a crash dive to evade the drifter, then, quote, "The navigator reported the conning tower hatch closed, but as we went under, heavy flooding occurred through the hatch." So water cascaded down from the conning tower into the guts of the U-boat, flooding the motors, the pumps, and the electric batteries. With the water knee-deep and rising, first the interior of the submarine was plunged into darkness.
Honestly, that's terrifying. Submarines scare me so much. The idea of being stuck down there.
It's going to get even scarier. At that point, the flooded batteries began electrolyzing the seawater. Now, if you ever did the classic classroom experiment in school, you might remember that you can electrolyze pure water, H2O, into its component elements, hydrogen and oxygen. Seawater additionally contains, among other things, sea salt, sodium chloride, which when electrolyzed, just like water, splits, producing sodium and chlorine gas. Chlorine gas, ironically enough, one of the very same gases used by Germany in the trenches
used in the war,
as a deadly chemical weapon. And the UB-85 is starting to fill up with it. In desperation, Krech ordered the ballast to be blown, forcing the vessel back to the surface. As it rose, the Coreopsis then opened fire on the submarine. Krech told his superiors, "We could not return fire because our ammunition was underwater and the water was rising in the boat." And so they hoisted the white flag and the UB-85's crew were taken off in rowing boats as prisoners of war. Before abandoning the ship, Captain Krech and his navigator scuttled the boat to prevent it falling into the hands of the British. Quote, "The UB-85, along with all the secret documents and codebooks, sank in 260 feet.
P.S. There was a little fight with a monster.
There was a monster. Yeah, I mean, it is a riveting war story, but as you say, there's something missing. There's no monster. So could it be that the German Admiralty simply refused to acknowledge the monster part of the story and only recorded the events of the actual capture? After all, this account begins the day of the battle with the Coreopsis, after the night of the supposed monster attack. Is there some room here for the monster attack to have happened earlier, causing damage to these bulkhead doors, and that's why the flooding of the conning tower was able to swamp the rest of the boat? Because, the captain's account seems notably devoid of any reason given for the hatches failing. Suspiciously devoid, you might say.
Blame the navigator. He's throwing the navigator right under the bus. The navigator said the hatch was closed. We went down, covered in water everywhere. Oh, navigator.
Wait until you hear about this. The throwing under the bus Olympics are about to begin. So, the captain's account is devoid of any reason for the hatches failing, apart from blaming it on someone else. The senior stoker's account, though, isn't devoid of a reason. Julius Gottschammer alleged that Captain Krech had demanded an electric radiator be installed in the officers' quarters. These compartments in a World War I submarine didn't have modern wall sockets of any kind. In order to power an electric heater, cables had to be routed via the conning tower and the control room. From what I can gather, normally the conning tower is like an airlock, kinda. You've got an outer hatch, which usually keeps the ocean out, and an inner hatch. If the outer hatch fails, or if you have to dive in a hurry and fail to properly close it, as long as the inner hatch is sealed properly, the conning tower will flood, but the internal parts of the ship remain sealed and dry. The captain had these cables running through the open inner hatch, the second line of defence against the sea, so when they were forced to dive unexpectedly, and the outer hatch wasn't shut properly, thanks to these cables preventing the inner hatch from fully sealing, when they dive, suddenly the Irish Sea has found its way in. As disappointing as it might be, it would appear that the UB-85 probably wasn't sunk by a monster, but because Captain Krech was chilly in his bed at night.
Poor soul.
Yeah, he wasn't U-boat captain of the century. As a little side note, I managed to find reference to another mishap under his command, same submarine, earlier in the same year, in the 1969 book U-Boat Intelligence 1914 to 1918 by Robert McQueen Grant. It's mentioned that when UB-85 and UB-86 were sailing together north of Denmark, Krech for some reason mistook his own boat's sister ship for an enemy vessel and opened fire on her. He missed, though.
It was a monster. A monster made me do it.
That's his excuse for everything. So how did this one particular naval historical footnote ever come to be associated with a monster in the first place? It's hard to say. The earliest version of this story online dates only as far back as 2005. One Rob Romero posted the account to a naval history forum called uboat.net, and when pressed for a source, he links to a site called americanmonsters.com, which is unfortunately now dead, but you can get it on the Wayback Machine. The American Monsters version of the story isn't sourced or referenced at all. There's no way to trace where they got it from. Plus, the site in general is quite sensationalistic, doesn't seem a particularly credible source, so at first, I wondered if the webmaster there had simply made it up. As much of a cop-out as that seems, it is something we've seen before, unfortunately, like the Angie Cooney lake case that we talked about during the Maria Tallarico episode.
Yeah.
But I have managed to track down a 1977 book called Sea Monsters, a collection of eyewitness accounts, which does appear to include an account of the UB-85 incident. Unfortunately...
Who gave the account then? Who gave the eyewitness account?
This is the thing, right? Unfortunately, Google Books will only let you search tiny snippets of that book, and it's long out of print.
Yeah.
I was able to find a used copy on an online bookseller for $10, and I bought it because it's a collection of eyewitness accounts of sea monsters. Why not, right?
Who wouldn't want to own that book, man?
Exactly. Unfortunately, it hasn't arrived yet. It was like a 2-month turnaround or something on it getting here. It's coming from America.
We've talked about doing an episode of a kind of addendum or update on the topics that we've covered before, so maybe that's something that could be put into
that actually is a good point. There is a little bit more to this, though. I did find a little bit further information. Although I can't yet vouch for the details of the account in that book, except to say that I think it is in there based on what Google has shown me. I think we can confidently assert that the story of the sea monster attack in UB-85 is definitely not a product of the internet age, as I almost concluded. It might also appear in Bernard Heuvelmann's In the Wake of Sea Serpents, a seminal book on cryptozoology, published in 1965, originally in French, later translated into English. Google Books throws that book up when you search for the term UB-85 just on its own. It's like one of the first ones that pops up in Google Books, which tells me it must be mentioned in there. But it doesn't let you actually search inside. And second-hand copies of that book range up to about 900 quid. So for the sake of adding an extra few years to the age of the legend...
Slightly outside of the Talking to Dawn budget.
Yeah. Maybe in future we'll come back to that when we're flush with cash. So the story was certainly around in the mid to late 20th century. Was it one of these things like the possession of Maria Tallarico, where it was an oral thing that then did the rounds of newspapers and magazines and a game of telephone, you know? Part of me does wonder as well if Craig himself might indeed have given his captors a monster story in order to avoid admitting that he had fucked up, basically. In an article in The Guardian that talks about the rediscovery of the UB-85 in the North Channel, Dr. Innes McCartney, a marine archaeologist and historian at Bournemouth University, makes an interesting point about the environment in which a lot of these far-out tales, this and others, arose out of the wars. He says, you've got to remember that after the war, the records were sealed, and there were all these people with some connection to British intelligence who yearned to boast of mighty deeds at sea, but couldn't tell the actual true stories. So there's two connected things here. The first one is the sealing of records. Records on the First World War were sealed for 50 years. And individual military actions like this, without huge loss of life or anything, they were generally not reported much in the newspapers at the time. They would have been considered sensitive information. I've spent longer than I would care to admit trawling through old Scottish newspapers around this date to try and find any mention of this, and nothing. Therefore, the details of the UB-85's capture appear to have been classified until 1968, 3 years after Heuvelmann's book on sea serpents was published. Therefore, if Heuvelmann's wrote about this, as appears to be the case, and if anyone has access to that book, please do get in touch, then that would appear to be one of the earliest, if not the earliest mention of this story in print, and that was first published about 3 or 4 years before the records were unsealed. Therefore, he was almost certainly working from oral accounts. He had no recourse to official documents at that time. It's very likely the monster version of the UB-85's capture, as we hear it today, was crystallised long before anyone was able to cross-reference it against actual military records, which, as we've said, were sealed. Which brings us to the second thing, oral accounts. Innes McCartney, the historian, believes this tale was born in the drawing rooms of gentlemen's clubs in the wake of the war. You know, old Dartmouth and Sandhurst boys gathering round a bottle of cognac of an evening and trying to outdo each other with tall tales of ghostly regiments and no man's land ghouls and U-boat eating sea monsters, kind of mixing together the hard facts of their wartime experience with the uncanny and creepy kinds of things that have been making fireside stories fun since the Paleolithic.
And why not?
Yeah, I mean,
why
exactly. It's a sort of creepy pasta of the day, right?
Other than ruin historical accounts.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Why not?
It is important to bear in mind that there is a very well documented tradition of folklore and tall tales in particularly the Navy and Merchant Marine. It was part of the culture, has been for centuries. Now, we often say on Talking Till Dawn that very often myths or folklore or urban folklore grow from a kernel of truth, most often.
Yeah.
This particular story, though, perhaps cautions us that while that may well be true, sometimes, and probably even most of the time, to be fair, the seed of truth in a legend might not be the sexy far-out parts we want to be true. It might just be the boring bits. If you can call a sea battle a boring bit.
I thought you were going to turn around and tell me that when you said it had been on Mysterious Universe, and again, I've read some fascinating stuff on that website, and I'm not trying to criticise people that write on it, but there is stuff that I've researched myself on topics there, and sometimes it's quite easy to find information that undermines what's been posted in some of those articles.
Yeah.
So I thought you were going to say
the whole thing was made up.
There's no record of this at all.
Yeah,
but
right.
Like you say, it comes from a kernel of truth, and that is that there was some sort of there was a U-boat that sank.
Most of the story is true, apart from
the best bit.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean that's an important lesson for us to bear in mind going into the remainder of this episode, but especially the next episode, because in part 2 we will be looking into some of the most striking and weird and far out accounts of sea monsters that I've ever come across. There's some weird shit coming in episode 2, I tell you.
I'm still kind of hoping though that there was some sort of encounter, and that book you mentioned that
it's going to crack it wide open.
Yeah, that it'll mention someone that was on that U-boat, and I was like, this fool over here's blaming a radiator. It was a radiator, it was a bloody big beast.
It was just the chlorine gas talking.
Hi, that's the code name. Wow, that sounds like when they called the Brits called the tank, the water tank, is the code name for it, and that's why it's called tank. I think that's true. I don't know if that's a myth or not.
Oh, right, so that they wouldn't... Right, I see what you mean, yeah.
I think that's why it was called the tank, because it was the term they would use in case spies picked up the development of it.
Maybe
the radiator. The radiator is the code name for some sort of beast under the water. That's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Maybe the Germans had captured and trained an old North Sea serpent to attack Allied vessels, and the UB-85 and the UB-85 was actually shepherding it into the Clyde so that it could attack the shipyards there, but then it went haywire and attacked. The Scots are too cool, I can't attack them, and then so it attacked the German vessel instead, and then swam out to sea, and it was happy for the rest of its life. Lived a long and healthy life.
Put off by the weather.
Yeah, all falls into place. Keep joining the dots, Michael.
The end. Good night, everybody.
But for now, let's look at a slightly less controversial, but I think no less fascinating encounter between a military vessel and something large and mysterious in the depths of the ocean. Kind of a counterpoint to the UB-85 incident, actually. In 1978, the USS Stein, a Knox-class frigate of the United States Navy, was on patrol in the Eastern Pacific. The Knox-class frigates were primarily designed as anti-submarine escorts. Obviously, by 1978, anti-submarine warfare had come a long way from chucking some depth charges on a fishing boat.
Come a long way from radiators in the offices.
The USS Stein was fitted with a huge underwater sonar dome on the bow, beneath the hull, for tracking enemy submarines. At some point on this patrol, and we don't know precisely where it was because a lot of the information on its operations is still classified, but we know it visited Ecuador, Peru, Mexico and Panama at various points during this operation. At some point on this mission, the sonar dome suddenly went haywire and died. The ship's engineers tried their best to bring it back online, but this wasn't something that could be fixed at sea. The sonar dome seemed to have suffered some catastrophic physical damage of some kind. The Stein was now blind below the waterline, so the captain ordered the Stein to return to base. Once the USS Stein was safely in dry dock, a team of engineers and Petty Officer Ira Carpenter went to examine the dome. This is Carpenter himself, in his own words, as he was interviewed in Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World in 1980.
I loved that show.
We noticed that there were some quite long scratches starting from the front and the side and down underneath the dome itself. The longest one, I would say, was about 4 feet long. At the bottom of each one of these cuts, or at least 90% of the cuts, was something embedded underneath the rubber coating itself. Of course, I was interested to determine what that was. I had never seen anything like this before. This type of damage was brand new to me. So I used my knife to pick out this foreign object underneath the no-foul coating. And it looked to me like it was a claw. And I quipped to my SW officer at the time. I said, look here, it looks like we have been attacked by a bunch of small alligators.
That's amazing.
So, as he says there, both the no-fill anti-fouling elastomer coating on the outside of the sonar dome and the underlying metal were punctured and sliced and rent by something that left behind hard, sharp teeth or possibly claws in the damaged surface. And this is what had irreparably damaged the multi-million-dollar sonar system of the USS Stein. The episode also includes a short interview with a naval marine biologist by the name of Dr. Forrest Glenn Wood, or to give him his full name, Dr. Forrest Glenn Wood Valley Sea Mountain Lake.
I hope that's a joke.
As he speaks here, he's holding up a strip of the sonar dome's elastomer coating, and it looks like, well, like a big slice of Swiss cheese or something. Here's what he had to say.
This is a small piece of the no-foul covering that was taken from the sonar dome of this ship. In many of these cuts were found teeth or claws, such as this one.
And at this point, he holds up a barb-like object that's about the length of his thumbnail.
It's apparent that whatever did this damage grasped the dome and ripped all the way through this rubber covering to the metal below.
The barb that Dr. Wood shows on camera is about 1 to 2 centimetres long, I would say. Petty Officer Carpenter's description of the hooks or teeth in general, comparing them to the teeth of tiny alligators, jives with this. Fully grown alligators' teeth are about 2.5 to 5 centimetres long, so a 1 or a 2 centimetre barb is indeed like a mini alligator's tooth.
I think that it must be from a squid because squids do have claws or hooks similar to this. Nothing else that is known in the ocean has structures of this kind. This doesn't rule out something that we haven't found yet, because undoubtedly there are creatures in the sea that are not yet known to science.
I've seen articles claiming these hooks that were retrieved from the sonar dome were so huge that the squid that attacked the ship must have been 150 feet in length. There's some statements made a little bit later on in the documentary that kind of allude to this as well. The US Naval Institute stated, "These claws are the type found in the suction cups on the tentacles of the giant squid." Alarmingly, the only specimens of claws previously collected were a fraction of the size of those recovered from the Stein. The giant squid, Architeuthis dux, is one of the most fantastical and mysterious beasts to exist in our oceans. It is not a rumour, it is not a figment of mythology, although it certainly features in and has inspired a lot of mythology. Arguably, it did once inhabit the position of fanciful monster before being identified and examined and studied by science, but it is a real, honest-to-goodness, giant sea monster that undoubtedly exists. Maybe sea monster sends the wrong message here, I don't know. It is a real animal though, and it's an important part of the deep sea ecology. They have a torpedo-like head and mantle, large eyes, razor-sharp beak, 8 arms and 2 elongated feeding tentacles tipped with clubs covered in suckers. If you include these 2 long tentacles in the overall length of the animal, these creatures can reach up to 40 to 60 feet, 13 to 18 meters in length, depending on sex, with the females being somewhat larger than the males. The suckers of the giant squid, and this is something we'll come back to in a few minutes with regard to the objects that were found embedded in the Stein's sonar dome, are encircled on the inside by chitinous, toothed rings, razor sharp, that gouge into their prey and lock in place. These animals typically inhabit depths between 300 and 1,000 meters, and they eat primarily fish and other squid. I would not want to be one of those fish or other squid, Michael.
Definitely not. I was just thinking about the suction cup kind of burrowing its way into your skin.
Nasty.
Yeah.
Nasty. It's extremely rare for a living Architeuthis ducks to be encountered near the surface, and when it does happen, it's almost always because the animal is injured. In fact, it wasn't until 2002 that a living Architeuthis was photographed for the first time. And that was a small, dying 13-foot male that came to the surface in Goshiki Beach in Japan. It wasn't until 2004 that a healthy living Architeuthis was photographed in its natural environment at 900 meters depth by a team of Japanese researchers. The first video was captured in 2006. But the giant squid does not appear to be rare. It's simply that its habitat is one that doesn't overlap much with pretty much any human activity, so that it seems elusive to us because of that. However, despite this apparent elusiveness, and contrary to some over-sensational books I read when I was younger, the existence of Architeuthis is in fact something that has been accepted and recognised by modern science for about 150 years. Their distribution is very widespread. They seem to inhabit most areas of the sea where the depths exist for them, with the exception of them being rare at the equator and rare at the poles. So dead Architeuthis have been washing up on beaches, and dying ones have been encountered at the surface by sailors, and they've been found in the stomach contents of sperm whales, their main predator, for centuries, albeit still infrequently enough to cause a bit of a stir when they do so. And this goes right back to Aristotle and Pliny the Elder. There are accurate and very matter-of-fact descriptions of dead squid washed ashore or pulled up by fishermen, matching the size and shape of Architeuthis even as far back as that. And in much the same way that ancient discoveries of fossilised dinosaur bones might have planted the seed for some of the legends of dragons, some folklorists believe that sightings of sick Architeuthis half glimpsed in the murky sea by sailors or found mutilated on the shoreline might have served as part of the inspiration for certain legendary sea monsters such as the Skula or Scylla in Greek mythology, the Hydra, and of course the Kraken or Kraken of Scandinavian folklore, a being so closely associated with Architeuthis in modern parlance that it's almost used as a synonym today. Kraken rum has the Latin name Architeuthis dux printed on the bottle, although the label shows an octopus that looks nothing like Architeuthis. Always annoyed me.
I should write to them.
Get your cephalopod straight, mate.
Dear Kraken rum.
I think you will find the first real rigorous scientific studies of Architeuthis were published by a Danish professor called Johannes Japetus Smith Steenstrup in the 1850s, based on pieces of beach specimens from Denmark and the Bahamas. It was he who coined the name Architeuthis from arch, as in chief or principal, like arch enemy, and teuthis meaning squid, and dux meaning leader.
Archvile from Doom 2.
Yeah, exactly. Contemporaneous with Steenstrup's studies into the creature was an incident involving a giant squid that not only further boosted scientific understanding of these animals, but also, with the growth of the world newspaper media at that moment in time, helped fire the imaginations of readers all over the planet with a very real, thrilling and down-to-earth account, for the first time not fogged and exaggerated by 100 retellings, but reprinted around the world in the actual words of a rational, analytical, scientifically minded first-hand witness. This was the encounter between the crew of the French corvette Electon, a seagoing paddle steamer about 150 miles northeast of Tenerife, off the coast of North Africa in November 1861. The lookout spotted off the port side, quote, a large body partly submerged on the surface, an object he initially mistook for a piece of mast painted red. The following is an English translation of a letter by Captain M.F. Bouyer that I found published in the Charleston Daily News on the 31st of May 1866, but was also printed in various newspapers around the world. And I don't have a time machine, by the way. I used Google Newspapers Archive.
Disappointed. Always thought there was something about you, Martin. You've been working on one somewhere in a basement.
Yeah, I used my time machine, obviously. The Electon was approaching the object in full speed. I attentively examined the thing so differently described, and I recognised the gigantic cuttlefish or poulp the contested existence of which seems real only in mythology. I was nearly in the presence of one of these strange beings which the ocean sometimes throws forth from its depths, as if to defy science. Here was a good opportunity, and I determined to study the monster as near as possible, and to take hold of it if it was possible. I immediately got everyone on board ready. They loaded the guns, fixed the harpoons and ropes for their new sport. Unfortunately, the sea was very rough. The ship was rolling dreadfully, and the manoeuvring difficult when the animal, although remaining always on the water, was moving at ease and seemed disposed to keep away from the ship. After several encounters, which only enabled us to give it about 20 shots, 19th century zoology at its finest there.
I know. Kill it! Kill it! Put it on a wall!
Imagine a giant squid above your fireplace.
Aye, what's that? Ah, it's just a sea monster.
Ah, never mind. Brandy. So he goes on to say, this did not seem to hurt it. We succeeded to throw a harpoon with a lasso. We were preparing to I don't think they're a cowboy. I think they attached the lasso to a spear. I don't think they're a guy like...
Every ship is given the...
Just in case they encounter a squid. Yeah, he's our squid cowboy. Or squid boy. We were preparing to increase the number of ropes when, in consequence of a powerful movement of the animal, the harpoon, which had not firmly fastened in its glutinous envelope, love that phrasing, gave way. The part of the animal where the rope had fastened broke, and we succeeded only in carrying off a part of its tail. So, by tail, he's referring to the fins at the top of the mantle of the squid.
Right.
But we had seen him near enough to enable us to give an exact description of it. It is the Incarné gigantesque, the giant squid. It seemed to measure 18 feet from head to tail, in the shape of a parrot's beak, with 8 powerful arms, 5 or 6 feet long. Its aspect is hideous, colour dark red, with ugly eyes as large as a plate. Officers and men were all anxious to lower a boat in order to go and catch the monster, and perhaps they might have been successful, but I was afraid that in the encounter, the animal might capsize the boat with its arms and kill some of them with its powerful claws, which, it is said, are charged with galvanic electricity. Side note, this seems to be part of old sailors' lore. The giant squid is not electric. If there is another species of giant squid out there that can electrocute its prey, God help us all.
Yeah.
I did not think proper to expose the lives of my men in order to gratify my curiosity, and therefore gave up the pursuit of the monster, who instinctively avoided us by diving and passing to the other side of the ship when we were approaching. Now that I have seen the strange animal, and seen it too with my own eyes, I dare not deny any longer the many descriptions given by navigators. The sea has not spoken its last words yet. It keeps in its depths specimens of extinct races, or elaborates in its ever-working crucible untold monsters for the terror of the sailors, and the subjects of mysterious legends of the sea.
This guy could definitely write Lovecraftian horror.
Yeah, that was good. The size of the creature described there by the captain of the Alecton, about 25 feet including the tentacles, 7.5 meters, we now know is actually on the titchy side for Architeuthis. In 2003, the racing yacht Geronimo, which was at that time attempting to win the Jules Verne trophy quite aptly, trying to beat the world record for the fastest circumnavigation of the globe, was attacked by a 10-meter long giant squid, not terribly far from where the Alecton encounter occurred. Whereas the Alecton had its encounter a little to the northeast of the Canaries, the Geronimo met its monster squid just a little further north towards the top of Morocco and the Straits of Gibraltar. But that general area of northwest Africa does seem to be a particular hotspot for these creatures. Something to think about after lockdown next time you're on holiday in Tenerife or Morocco somewhere and fancy going in for a swim. The Geronimo was a trimaran with nacelles out to the sides of the main deck, open water covered in netting between the deck and the nacelles. The crew, captained by Olivier de Kersauzon,
That's easy for you to say.
I'm not French enough, realised it forces you to do a French accent.
I know, that's just what I was thinking there.
Realised something was wrong when the entire vessel shuddered and they discovered they were no longer able to turn their rudder. Something appeared to be trapped in the rudder blade, so they went to check it out. Crew member Didier Rago as quoted in the newsletter of World Sailing, the sport's governing body, said, "It was a giant squid. The tentacles were as thick as my arms plus the waterproofs. Amazing. To begin with, it was jammed between the top of the rudder blade and the hull, and then it sent two of its tentacles down to the base of the rudder blade and grasped it right the way around at fence level. I saw it astern after it had let go, and I reckon it was about 10 metres long, absolutely enormous. It's the first time I've ever seen one so big. It shook the whole boat, and it was rather worrying at the time. If it had managed to climb on board, we'd have had to offer it lunch or something to keep it from lunching on us." We were all ready to do battle with boat hooks and knives, but as soon as we slowed the boat down, it obviously decided that it would be better to let us go while it had the chance, and that's exactly what it did. Our first concern was whether or not it had damaged the boat. We slowed the boat immediately to check for damage, but luckily the only problem was a small amount of water in the bearings. We lost about an hour, or maybe an hour and a quarter. We were doing 24 knots at the time, so we probably lost at least 30 miles by slowing down to just 11 knots. So, a 10-metre squid is absolutely immense, I'm sure you'll agree.
Yeah.
But it's still not the biggest that's been found. 14 metres, or 46 feet, is the conservative record for the largest giant squid recovered. There are reports from decades ago of dead squid washed up with a length of 18 metres or 60 feet from tail to tentacle tip. However, these are controversial due to lack of standardisation in the measurement methodology. The tentacles of a giant squid are basically huge elastic muscles. They can be stretched out like Stretch Armstrong if you really want to exaggerate the size. So nowadays the standard is to measure the tentacles in the relaxed position, so you always get like a standard measurement. So we may not be comparing like with like in terms of the really huge claimed specimens from the past. But as we see in the Geronimo case, the behaviour that an Architeuthis instinctively exhibits when struck by a large unknown object such as a ship seems to be to latch onto it. This could well be an adaptation to their natural predators, whales and large sharks. Grab on for dear life. If you can hold on to the side or the back of a hungry whale, you can more easily stay away from its mouth than if you dodge away into open water. Then wait till it tires and then boost away. This behaviour is possibly the origin of tales of giant squid trying to pull ships down. The wandering suckered arms wriggling up the sides of the boat probably didn't help dispel that misconception, but you have to remember that the arms are their main sensory organ, especially in daylight, which is almost certainly like a blindingly dazzling whiteness to a creature that's adapted to the murky depths. These animals are not, as far as we know, interested in humans as a meal.
Unless they look on a ship as a big can, just ready to be opened with some juicy morsels in there.
Well, just because they don't appear to be interested in the taste of human flesh, it doesn't mean you'd want it to grab you out of curiosity or surprise. The serrated suckers, the razor sharp beak, could do a lot of damage very, very quickly. And they're essentially jet powered. They jet out water so they could pull you down into the dark.
Yeah.
To get a better look at you, even just they could yank you down 100 feet and you die of compression, probably at the speed they could pull you down at. They might not even be trying to kill you, they might just be curious and you'd be finished. There are a very few, not terribly well documented, reports of humans having been pulled down and drowned by Architeuthis or suspected Architeuthis, primarily around the Labrador coast during World War II, following torpedo attacks on ships. We're back at submarines again for some reason.
Is the Labrador coast in Canada?
Yes, northeast Canada. I've not been able to find any substantiated reports of giant squid fatalities since the Second World War. It has been theorised that Architeuthis has a fascination with the colour red, and sailors at that time wore deep red life jackets, which I might be wrong about this, but I think that's not quite as common anymore as a colour for military life jackets. It's also not quite so common for ships to be torpedoed and sailors to be bobbing around in the ocean as well, I guess.
Yeah.
You have to wonder maybe if it was, the giant ships falling down into the depths that's then falling through the layer where they live and disturbing them and sending them up to the surface. But anyway, we've gone on a bit of a tangent here about Architeuthis to sort of curve way back onto the USS Stein and the question of these teeth or claws found in the radar dome. As we've said, Architeuthis does have these sharp, serrated rings positioned inside the suckers on its tentacle clubs, but each individual point on those serrated rings is much smaller than what was found in the USS Stein. If you picture the serrations on like a really sharp bread knife but positioned on a cookie cutter instead, with sort of like a bristly look to it, it's hard to kind of describe, but those are about the size of a bread knife's serrations is about the size of a large Architeuthis claw. The claws in the USS Stein are about 3 or 4 times longer than those serrations, at least. If a really big Architeuthis is about 50 feet long, and these teeth are about 3 times longer than those found on a giant squid of that size, you can see how some commentators have made the inference that whatever attacked the Stein must have been 150 feet or 45 meters long. It seems like a reasoned, if incredible, assumption to make, especially when combined with the observation that sperm whales have been found with sucker scars that are 12 inches in diameter, much, much bigger than any Architeuthis that's ever been found.
Yeah, I was going to say that I'd read that before, that I don't think it's just with squid suckers. I think it's also they found other wounds on certain whales that make people think that there are still some pretty big animals, predatory animals down there perhaps to discover.
Yeah, so this was something I always read about growing up as well, and it always kind of chilled me. However, I have discovered that we actually have to be quite careful about reading too much into that. This point about the giant sucker marks was a popular talking point in documentaries and unexplained mysteries type books until the 90s or so, but it's now understood that if a juvenile sperm whale is scarred in this way, the scar will grow with the animal as it matures.
Ah, right.
So that could be where these giant sucker marks are coming from. If like an adolescent whale is injured by a giant squid and then grows to 3 times its length, the sucker marks are going to grow with the whale. So these claims of 150 feet squid are not particularly reliable, not from this evidence anyway. Also, in researching this, and especially in finding that Arthur C. Clarke episode, and seeing one of the claws, because I'd never seen the claws before, I'd read this case, but I'd never actually seen the claws with my own eye. So these teeth, the fangs, whatever you want to call them, I don't believe that the underlying assumption that has led some writers to propose 150-foot squid as the answer to the Stein's mysterious damage, I don't believe that's a correct assumption, because it starts by assuming an Architeuthis or something of identical proportions to an Architeuthis made this damage. And then it basically says, by how much do we need to scale up the whole animal until the serrations and the squid suckers are the length of these claws we pulled out of the sonar dome?
Yeah.
But I don't think whatever attacked the sonar dome was an Architeuthis dux. The object Dr. Wood holds up is not only longer than one of the serrations from Architeuthis' suckers, it's a somewhat different shape. Whereas the giant squids are kind of, if you imagine, like flattened and triangular, like teeth, this is much more of a cylindrical, slightly curved, thin, long, like a cat's claw almost, that he holds up.
Yeah.
With apparently more of a piercing hooking function than this sort of serrating gouging function of the Architeuthis claw. Dr. Wood, in the video, it should be noted, doesn't specifically name Architeuthis as the source of the claws. He does say it could be something that was unknown to them at the time. That comment about Architeuthis being the source of the claws is something that mostly appears in secondary sources. I think a lot of that is down to people using the term giant squid generically rather than for this specific species Architeuthis dux, and then confusion arises from that. I do, however, think it's likely that these came from a squid, but is it something from a known species or is it from something completely unknown to science? In trying to get to the bottom of that, I have looked at more tentacles online than... Not going to make a joke at anime fans' expense, but you get where I was going with that.
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. I knew that was coming. Alan will be furious.
Now, I should say I'm not a zoologist, so this is just based on my absolutely non-expert research. But I think there's a few possibilities here. Perhaps the most intriguing is that these claws came from something else, something that was virtually unknown at the time of the USS Stein incident, something that was then only known to science from a few tiny digested fragments in the guts of predators and small, immature specimens brought up by fishermen in the Southern Ocean. I'm talking about a squid that, in the 1970s, was so little understood that it's possible Dr. Forrest Wood had never even heard of it, let alone had any inkling that it was something that, in adulthood, could dwarf the giant squid. Mesonychoteuthis hamiltoni was first described by Guy Coburn Robson in the winter of 1925 in the form of two brachial crowns retrieved from the stomach of a sperm whale killed by whalers in the Southern Ocean. The brachial crown is the ring of muscle that surrounds the beak and from which the arms of the squid extend. No mantles, heads, arms, or complete tentacles were recovered along with these brachial crowns, having been severed and digested by the whale. So Robson was not able to infer much about the overall shape and the precise size of the animal, but he was able to determine that it was something new to science, belonged to the family Cranchidae, most species of which are tiny, transparent, so-called glass squid, but that this species, by contrast, he could immediately tell, grew to a considerable size. Now, that wasn't particularly earth-shattering, or even particularly newsworthy information at the time. There are a lot of large squid species out there. Architeuthis was, at that time, the largest known, but you also have the robust clubhook squid of the northern Pacific, Onychia robusta it's called, which can reach up to 4 meters in total length and is quite often mistaken for the giant squid. That's still a considerable animal. That's two of me lying down.
Yeah, and let's be honest, Martin, you're pretty tall.
I'm half a slightly smaller giant squid, yeah. There's also the giant warty squid, and I think I'll pass on taking a swim with that one. It grows to 2.3 meters. There's several others as well. So Robson's paper was published, the specimens presumably stuffed in a jar and buried in a storeroom somewhere. And for most of the 20th century, Mesonychoteuthis hamiltoni was a dry, little-known Latin name in the back of a textbook on Antarctic cephalopods. In the 1970s, before the Stein encounter, a handful of what would later be revealed to be immature specimens of Mesonychoteuthis were studied by Soviet scientists. They were notably large squid, but nothing that would challenge Architeuthis. They were, as would later be revealed, well, babies. In 1981, the year after the Mysterious World documentary aired, a slightly more mature but still not fully grown Mesonychoteuthis was pulled out of the Ross Sea on the coast of Antarctica by a Russian trawler. It measured 4 meters in length. Impressive, a seriously big animal, but again, this only puts it on a par with the likes of the robust clubhook squid. It was not until the 2000s, and a series of discoveries of progressively more and more complete, more mature, larger, and in some cases still living specimens, that it truly sunk in that there genuinely was a cephalopod larger than Architeuthis in Earth's oceans. And it was around this time that Mesonychoteuthis took on its more infamous, common name, the Colossal Squid. The Colossal Squid, in its adult form, is far more massive than the giant squid, and it is, in fact, the heaviest living invertebrate species on the planet. As far as we know, that is. The largest captured specimen weighed 495 kilograms, or half a ton.
That's a lot of calamari.
An analysis of beaks extracted from the stomach contents of sperm whales show that individuals up to 700 kilograms probably exist in the depths. Or at the very least, that 700 kilograms is the largest Mesonychoteuthis a sperm whale will hunt. It's likely that the largest Architeuthis probably grow slightly longer than the longest colossal squid, because Architeuthis, the giant squid, is more long and slender in profile, so technically the giant squid is still the longest squid, but the colossal squid are built, they're thick with 2 C's.
Yeah.
much bulkier, heavier, more powerful animals. In addition, these creatures have the largest eyes in the animal kingdom by quite some margin, 12 to 16 inches in diameter.
Terrifying.
Imagine looking over the side of the boat and seeing that staring up at you.
I love the sea, but
Not anymore.
yeah, it gives me the heebie-jeebies.
It's believed that one reason the colossal squid has such large eyes, when they live at a depth where sunlight doesn't really perceptibly penetrate at all, is that it gives them the ability to detect the faint bioluminescence produced by plankton when large animals disrupt the water nearby. This gives them an early warning system for approaching predators such as sperm whales and sleeper sharks, both of which are known to prey upon these monsters of the deep. They probably also use this ability in hunting their own prey, which includes the huge 1 to 2 meter long Antarctic toothfish. A study by Laptikovsky et al. In 2015 showed out of 8,000 toothfish examined, 71 exhibited scarring from previous attacks by colossal squid, suction wounds, bite wounds, and gashes caused by the rotating, hooked claws on their tentacles. Claws that resemble those retrieved from the Stein sonar dome, certainly more than anything from a giant squid. It's likely that in addition to using their highly acute visual abilities to defend themselves, colossal squid have other senses to help them avoid predators, including perhaps a sensitivity to sonar. Sperm whales use high-pitched sonic vibrations to navigate the dimly lit depths of the ocean, and they use focused bursts of sound to stun their prey. This is the biological equivalent to sonar technology. So
Really, they used a burst of sound?
yeah, they can focus it really powerfully, and it's enough that the loudest calls of sperm whales in the ocean could severely injure a diver.
Wow.
It would rupture your eardrums and potentially damage your lungs and everything. They've got noise-making apparatus inside their skull that's like the size of the room that you're sitting in right now. So powerful, powerful animals. It's a little bit like, remember Echo the Dolphin?
Yeah.
Might a colossal squid, maybe an elderly or injured specimen drifting near the surface, have mistaken the huge, vaguely whale-shaped sonar dome beneath the Stein for its natural predator and instinctively attacked it? Certainly seems possible.
Yeah.
The counter-argument to this would be that the colossal squid's range does appear to be limited to the southern ocean around Antarctica. It only seems to live and spawn in very cold water. So, as far as is known, it doesn't come north of the tip of South America, the tip of South Africa, and the South Island of New Zealand. Of course, given how little is known about them, there might be a bit of wiggle room there, but there's a few reasons to believe a colossal squid wouldn't come much further north than that. They've never been found anywhere else, for one. Their beaks are only found in the stomachs of whales that frequent the Southern Ocean. They have a lot of adaptations for cold polar waters, and they also appear to fill an ecological niche there at the southern pole, which is specifically where the Architeuthis isn't found. So it's like these two animals have different ranges to avoid competing with each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You know, especially if you have one type of animal fills an evolutionary niche in one area,
Yeah.
and then another different species does it in a different area.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And you see that all over the world in various ecological niches. So although we don't know precisely where the USS Stein was at the time the sonar dome was attacked, it does seem to be a matter of record that during the voyage the ship called at Peru, Ecuador, Panama and Mexico, thousands of miles north of the edge of the colossal squid's normal range. So it could be that this was a very lost Mesonicoteuthis, sick and dying in the warmer water. I mean, it's a creature of the far depths, so if it's near enough the surface to attack the bottom of a ship, there's certainly something wrong. But that's a long way for it to have come. There is another known alternative that I kind of feel doesn't get enough of an airing when this case is brought up.
The Kraken.
Well, I was going to say, it could be something completely new and unknown. It could be something vast that very rarely comes to the surface that we just don't know about yet, and this is the only evidence we've seen. That is eminently a possibility here. But there is a kind of simpler possibility, shall we say. I'm surprised it doesn't get more attention, this idea, because the region in which the Stein is known to have been operating is right within this creature's traditional range. In fact, to my eye, it's such a solid contender for the owner of these hooks that I almost feel like there might be something I'm missing. Like, Is there something I'm not aware of as to why Dr. Wood, for example, doesn't suggest this as at least a possibility? Again, I'm no marine biologist, so I don't claim to know better than him, but when I look at the hook shown in the documentary, and I look at the hooks on the tentacles of the Humboldt squid, I can't help but think that's an equally good, if not better match than the colossal squid. Humboldt's Dosidicus gigas are the 5th largest known squid species by mass, and the 7th...
Really good at multiplication.
Yeah, and the 7th largest by total length and mantle length. A large adult Humboldt squid might grow 1.5 meters in mantle length, or about 5 foot, with the tentacles adding about another half meter. So a good 7 or 8 foot animal. But in extreme cases, these things have been known to grow up to 3.5, possibly 4 meters, and are by far the largest squid commonly encountered by humans. Unlike Architeuthis or Messinichiteuthis, this is an animal that regularly migrates up to near the surface to feed. These creatures are hunted for the seafood industry by specialised fishermen in Chile, Mexico and Peru, 3 of the countries that the Stein visited on its route. What these fishermen do is, from their boats, they shine powerful arc lights down into the deep ocean at night, which attracts shoals of krill, which attracts shoals of fish, which in turn lure up huge packs of Humboldt squid from the depths. The fishermen dangle these luminous barbed lures into the water that the Humboldt squid then envelop with their arms and become entangled, and the fishermen haul them on board using thick nylon lines. These squid are highly active and aggressive, at least in the violent confrontations with fishermen that form most of their human interactions. I've seen footage of these nighttime squid hunts, and they are like a vision of hell, Michael.
I must see this. I must see this.
There was a documentary on a few years ago about it. So these thrashing monsters being pulled out of like a murky sea, just churning with tentacles. The air is filled with jets of ink and brine and blood. In their natural habitat, though, the Humboldt squid is an intelligent and surprisingly social animal. They hunt cooperatively in packs like wolves. They communicate using body language and colour changes, chromatophores flashing red to signal complex information to their companions. But when they are the prey, when they are thrown into a state of agitation and panic, the squid often turn on one another, tearing and biting and devouring their shoal mates in the frenzy.
Oh, so it's as if they go completely berserk?
Yeah. So it's like they've developed a reputation as a cannibal species because of this, but they don't eat each other normally in the wild, or maybe they do, but not like the frenzies that the fishermen see. Yeah, they go berserk. That's probably the simplest way to put it. But it seems that their reflex when panicked or wounded is...
This fact that these are in a pack as well.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
So yeah, it's the reflex when panicked or wounded is simply to attack everything moving within reach, which is, in the case of the squid fisheries, usually other squid, and sometimes it's fishermen. So, could the Stein have sailed unwittingly into a shoal of Humboldt squid, which panicked and started attacking the sonar dome en masse? If Humboldt squid feels like a bit of a cop-out compared to some of the animals that we've been talking about, if it feels like it doesn't quite scratch your monster hunting itch, you should know that these creatures have one monstrous attribute that neither the giant nor the colossal squid can really boast of. Out with some poorly documented accounts and some debunked legends, that is. Humboldt squid are confirmed man-eaters. In the right circumstances, they will actively tear you to pieces. Mexican fishermen call them by the name Diablo Rojo, the Red Devils. In the frenzy of hunting or being hunted, large Humboldt squid can and have pulled under and drowned fishermen unlucky enough to fall into the water with them mid-hunt. Divers have been horribly mauled by their claws and their razor-sharp beaks, which can exert a bite force equal to that of an African lion. Researchers studying these animals in the water routinely wear chainmail over their diving suits, and even that is no guarantee of safety. The following is professional diver Scott Cassell recounting the time he was attacked by a small group of Humboldts he was attempting to film off La Paz in Mexico. I got hit in the left and the right almost simultaneously, with a ferocity I was not expecting. As I'm hit by these animals, I can feel them pinching into the back of my arms and the back of my neck with these incredible beaks. The most important thing is to stay away from that beak. If it bites you here, and he indicates his wrist, it can mechanically amputate your hand. And at that point, another squid sees my camera, reaches over from behind me, grabs my camera, and then pulls back as hard as he can, dislocating my right shoulder like it was nothing. As I'm horrified by the pain I've just experienced, 2 more grab onto my legs and start to pull me down. Cassell was pulled down so fast and so forcefully, his eardrums imploded.
Ugh.
He goes on, I started to fight for my life, kicking, scratching, using my wounded arm to hit the squid. As I'm trying to fight him off, he bites my wrist and breaks it before I can flinch and roll it out. The pressure broke my wrist in 5 places. Clawing back to the surface, I look up and see the boat just above me. I hit the surface and I grab onto the side of the panga, and I can see that they're coming back up. I didn't fend them off completely. They still wanted a piece. My pride was wounded, my ego was destroyed, my shoulder was damaged. So my very first dive with Humboldt squid, I got my ass kicked. I think that about says it all, really.
Oh man. His very first, so he went back.
I guess he must have done, yeah. It was in a documentary that I watched, and I think he actually filmed the footage in that documentary, so yeah, I think he did. Probably with some thicker chainmail.
Yeah, it's not chainmail, plate mail this time.
Yeah. A big full suit of armour. Straight to the bottom. So I do have a certain ambivalence about using the term monster in relation to most of these creatures.
Yeah.
The word obviously is relative. It hinges on our unfamiliarity with the creature being described. If mankind lived in the oceans, the Humboldt squid, the giant squid, the colossal squid, other, perhaps even stranger creatures unknown to modern science, wouldn't be seen as monsters at all. These, after all, are just animals doing what they do. There's no malevolence or inherent evil in them. If we were sea creatures exploring the land, we might see bears, wolves, lions, tigers, elephants as the land monsters of legend. So I don't want to demonize any of these creatures in the way that, sharks were demonized by Jaws and that kind of thing. But I think a pack of large Humboldt squid, towards the top end of the known size for that species,
are fucking monsters. They're fucking monsters.
I think they could have mistaken the radar dome of Stein for an approaching predator, and that could easily have inflicted the damage observed. And I think that is probably the most likely explanation in this case, given the shape of the claws and the likely region in which this took place. So, was the Stein attacked by a sea monster? Within the imperfect definition of the word? Sure, if we're happy to call the giant squid and colossal squid monsters, then the Humboldt squid fits that definition just as well in some ways, if not even better. But look, I get it. When we talk of monsters, we're thinking on some level of the unknown, of things that challenge accepted wisdom, that might rock the boat of the current zoological status quo, things that might inject a bit more wonder and mystery and fearful magic into our worldview. Humboldt squid are pretty cool, but you want to hear about encounters with things that modern science doesn't yet have any answer for. And I have a few things to share with you on that front as well. Starting with something I uncovered while researching this episode, a startling account from a forgotten 1970s magazine article. And the story recounted therein, as far as I can tell, has never really made it onto the internet. A story of an encounter with a seemingly impossible creature that resulted in the death of a lighthouse keeper. The monster of Serrana Cay. And I'll be telling you all about that in the next episode.
Can't wait.
I hope you like Pulpo a Feira. Yeah, so that's Giant Sea Monsters Attack Part 1, Michael.
I think we've maybe talked about this before. We might have touched upon it when we did the Loch Monsters episodes. There's something about the sea, the sort of abyssal nature of it, that conjures up, for me anyway, this alien landscape and what's really down there, maybe utterly inhuman in a way that we can't really even grasp in a lot of ways. And I think there's always the possibility of that in our minds. And when you were talking about the first case to do with the U-boat, man, this is like something you would have read. We've talked about this before, but both you and I, as kids, loved monster books and books that explored the unexplained. And that sort of thing, high seas adventure mixed with the unknown, it's a potent combination, and it's why these stories, even if sometimes these stories don't have the truth of a real monster behind them, there's still something about them that's just utterly compelling.
They have value as folklore, even if some of the details aren't necessarily accurate. Definitely.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing about the sea, that in a way is in some ways even more compelling than stories of aliens and things like that. Things that live in the depths of the sea, they're so close and yet so far. You know, we pass directly over them when we're in a boat, and they're right there.
Yeah.
They're maybe only a few hundred meters away from us. We can't see them. We don't know they're there. They're hidden by the reflective surface of the water. It's like a hidden world just out of reach. And it's a world that is hostile to human life. We can't really go there, but it's right there. It's right below us sometimes. That sense of something so alien and otherworldly being so close by, that really, I think, helps fire the imagination, and it can really see why sailors who spent months or years at sea staring down into the depths, no idea how deep this water is, no idea what's below them, but occasionally catching glimpses of things coming up. Like, I can see how these legends, and I'm not saying that the legends are all just active imaginations, but you can see why that became such a focus and a fixation for sailors, especially in past centuries when they weren't all sitting on their smartphones in their bunks when they were off duty.
And for the general public wanting to consume those stories, because hundreds of years ago, you know, there wasn't space exploration, there wasn't anything like that. The sea was this vast, untamed world, and that was exciting for people. It wasn't just stories about monsters and unbelievable creatures living in the sea. It was about strange lands, places, people,
dog-headed men.
Yeah, all of these things combined. And there was a highly speculative, I must admit, but there was a scientific paper where someone at least suggested, can't remember if it was squid or octopuses, or octopi, I don't know if that's the plural.
That's octopuses.
Yeah, octopuses.
I had to check this for the next episode.
Yeah, that they're the only species known that can alter their own RNA, and one idea behind that, because they're so different to us and so different to all other animals, really, was this idea that maybe they had either an extraterrestrial, not that they came here as aliens, but that maybe something was seeded here. There was a different line of life that led to them. And because most of them are soft-bodied, you know, the history of them isn't as well recorded as animals that aren't soft-bodied. I mean, it was highly speculative, obviously, and I know there's people that have... It was one of these papers that was published, and then people, you know, all of the popular news sites published it with clickbait.
Went a bit mad with it.
Yeah. And then people were coming out and saying, whoa, he wasn't saying that they're aliens, he was saying that maybe because they're able to alter their RNA, they may have come from something else, because they do seem utterly alien to other life forms on the planet.
I'm looking up now. It looks like they're not unique in being able to edit their RNA, but they can do it more than most other organisms. They're capable. It says they're capable of greater RNA editing, involving changes to nucleic acid sequence of the primary transcript of RNA molecules. So they do have some unique characteristics to the proteins in their cells that allow them to do that.
My point was that, you know, this idea of these things being kind of alien to us, that there are some people that had at least explored the idea that they may have actually been from somewhere else, or had a different origin, even if life had originated more than once on Earth, that maybe they came from a different line, you know, so, which I think is quite interesting. There was an argument about how organisms can absorb DNA and things like that. I mean, like I say, it's highly speculative. I'm not saying it's correct. I'm just saying that, as far as I remember, it was like a legitimate researcher was just questioning that idea in a paper, and then the media kind of ran with it as if, like, octopuses are aliens and they're all coming for us.
They're fantastically intelligent as well. I think that didn't hurt.
Yeah.
2 things didn't hurt that idea spreading. 3 things really. One is how different they are to animals that we're familiar with.
Yeah.
It's such a different organism to us that we almost use octopus and octopus-like features as shorthand for something that is scary and different. So like Cthulhu and how many sci-fi movies use creatures with octopus-like features like tentacles to represent a monster, because it's something we can imagine. We've seen it on Earth, but it's so different from us, so it's quite an easy thing to draw upon to instantly give something a sense of being spooky and different. The second thing is their intelligence. They're highly intelligent animals. They may in fact be one of the most intelligent non-human animals on the planet. And the third thing again is that whole idea that we were just talking about of the sea being considered this alien world of wonder. And so it's quite easy to imagine something in the sea being descended from alien life that arrived on comets, you know. So I think that all helped it sort of take root in the press and the public consciousness, whether it's true or not, you know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I doubt it, but who knows, you know.
It's interesting you're talking about like animals with tentacles. Now these things are like, you know, sort of known to us, but alien in a way, or frightening in a way, or monstrous in a way. But I do wonder if there's like a crossover, you know, in a lot of mythologies around the world and a lot of religions. You have the serpent.
Yeah.
And there's something about the tentacle that kind of invokes the idea of the serpent. Is very similar in construction. It can be very similar in movement. And you do wonder if in some cases people sort of drew from that mythology and then applied it to these devilfish, to these creatures, you know. So that'd be quite an interesting study for someone that was looking at
definitely
folklore around these things.
The octopus is something we're going to be digging into a little bit more in the next episode. We're going to kick off with the devilfish, or the lusca of the Western Atlantic, and then we're going to get into the monster of Serana Cay that doesn't really have any presence on the internet somehow. The only thing I can find on the internet is someone is selling the illustration from the magazine that I bought as a painting.
Yeah.
And someone mentions the artwork on another post somewhere, but the actual story is not fully retold. So we're going to be the first full retelling of this story on the internet as far as I can see.
Fantastic. It's kind of reassuring to me in some ways, since like the love of books and dusty tomes found in the bowels of museums and learned places that might contain these pieces of forbidden knowledge, all these sorts of ideas that excite you about the mysterious and the unknown.
This was not quite a dusty old tome. This was World of Wonder, a kid's science magazine, priced 10 pence.
No, what I meant by that was, it's not just that, but it's also, there's been a number of times on the podcast where we found things that they're only covered in a shallow way online, or aren't mentioned at all, and that kind of, it warms my heart to think that there are magazines and books and things that are not online for everyone to pull apart.
Still information to be uncovered.
Yeah.
The game of delving into the offline world to find new information is still a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure as the podcast continues, you and I will find many books that bring information to us. But before we go, if you're listening to this on YouTube, could you subscribe to the channel, please?
Or Spotify,
or if you're on a podcast, if you're listening to the podcast version of this, please do subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice. But also, if you wouldn't mind, it really helps us if you leave a review where you can, whether that's on iTunes or Apple Podcasts or wherever, Podcast Addict, whatever it is that you use to listen to the show, and spread the word on social media.
Yeah, tell one friend about the podcast.
Yeah, and then force them at gunpoint to watch. Listen even.
We look forward to doubling our listenership.
I know. We're very lucky. We're very lucky to we actually have a listenership, which some podcasts don't really have. True. So we're very, very lucky to have it. Anyway, on that bombshell.
Well, Michael, I think the sun is coming up.
It certainly is.
Sun is rising over the black ocean.
And I need to go to bed.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. I'm getting excited, Martin. I'm getting excited.